Hi, I'm Lynette and welcome. Today I'm going to be sharing with you my picks for the best and the worst eyeshadow formulas for beginners. Now I remember when I was new and fresh and green and a beginner when it came with eyeshadows. Now I haven't been in the eyeshadow game for very long. It's been a few years now, but I still remember what it was like when I first started out and trying to learn how to do my eyeshadows and what tools to use, what brushes, and then the eyeshadows and the formulas. So now that I've been doing this for a minute, I thought I would come and give you my take on the eyeshadow formulas that are the best for beginners, those people that are just getting started with eyeshadow application, and those that are the worst or not so good. Like these formulas, I would wait until I get a little experience under my belt and then I would check these out. So let's start with what I think are the best eyeshadow formulas. And I'm going to start off with an oldie but a goodie, Colourpop. Now, I know Colourpop gets talked about a lot on YouTube, but mostly because of all of the releases, the new releases that they do every other week. But I think oftentimes that gets lost in that conversation is the fact that Colourpop makes a really nice and a good eyeshadow formula. And I'm considering an eyeshadow formula that's good for beginners as one that's easy to work with, right? So Colourpop is in that category. This is their very first eyeshadow palette, the Yes Please palette, and it is a matte and a shimmer palette, but it's heavy on the matte. You can see it's been quite loved because this was one of the eyeshadow palettes that I got early on in my eyeshadow journey. And what I like about Colourpop, besides the price, because they are so affordable amongst so many eyeshadows out there on the market, they're still very affordable, but the quality of their eyeshadows is really good. The mattes are pigmented and blend well, and the shimmers shim, as my girl KK would say. They are metallic, they're shimmery, and that's, in my opinion, those types of eyeshadow formulas are the easiest to work with. When they have pigment, now maybe an eyeshadow might have a lot of pigment, but it blends out effortlessly. That to me is a good matte eyeshadow formula. And a shimmer formula that, again, doesn't take a lot of work to get it on your eye, to blend it out, to get it to adhere, and you actually see some shimmer. So that to me is a good shimmer formula, and Colourpop has both. And I have a number of Colourpop palettes. I hadn't ordered from them for quite some time up until recently. But I'm happy to report that since their very first launch of their very first eyeshadow palette, that their formula has remained consistent. Now, I'm not talking about pressed glitters. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the pressed eyeshadows, the matte pressed eyeshadow formula, and the matte metallic eyeshadow formula. Those are the formulas that I think, if you're a beginner, start with Colourpop. And the fact that it won't cost you a lot of money, because when you're first starting out, you don't want to spend a whole lot of money and you don't know what you're doing, okay? So get yourself a couple of Colourpop palettes, play, learn, experiment, and practice. Now, another eyeshadow formula that I don't think is like, oh, but it's good, and I think it's really good for beginners, and that's Anastasia Beverly Hills. That's a brand you don't hear about very much on YouTube anymore. But I remember when I first purchased the Master palette by Mario. This was a much hyped limited edition, and though, I mean, I wasn't crazy about the palette itself, like the color story, because, you know, it's just, you know, it's a neutral palette. But I do remember that the shadows blended out effortlessly. I mean, so easy. Took no time at all. Took no effort. Now, the formula for the mattes is really powdery, so you're gonna have a lot of kick up in your pan, just so you know. But you can go in however lightly or however heavily, and the shadow, the mattes are going to blend nicely. And then the metallic formula, very nice too. Not in your face, but nice, like formulas that you can use for every day, that you can use for work. I have the Jackie Aina palette. This is a much more recent launch from ABH, and here, I mean, they've you know, evolved over time. So you have like this eyeshadow here that's got a lot of glitter in it, but for the most part, the mattes still pigmented, still blend, and the shimmers in this palette, at least the Mario palette, a little more dull because, you know, I guess it was an everyday neutral palette, but the shimmers in here, really, really pretty. Nice little pops. Again, not too much, so you can wear them in the daytime, you can wear them to work, but still give you a nice shimmer to the eye. So yeah, Anastasia Beverly Hills, a good formula for beginners. Next up, we're going to get a little more expensive. Okay, I started you off with some very affordable options. Now we're going to get a little pricier. Now I think when it comes to beginners and eyeshadow, maybe you don't want to go in with high-end or luxury shadows in the beginning, because again, you don't really know what you're doing. You're just learning, you're trying to figure it out, trying to see if you like neutrals, if you're into color, and you're playing around and you're experimenting and you're trying to learn to blend and eyeshadow placement. So you might not want to spend a lot of money for eyeshadows when you're just starting out. But then on the other hand, because you are new to eyeshadow application, you're a beginner, and you want shadows that are going to work, that are going to be easy for you to learn with, you may want to spend the extra coin to get better quality. So in that category, we have Viseart. And Viseart is they're a brand for professionals, right? So their formula is going to work not just for the beginners, but for the professionals as well. But in saying that, they're not just for professionals. They're not it's not the kind of formula where you have to be a professional in order to know how to work it, in order to know how to use it. They work, in my opinion, for beginners as well. And I think they're a good formula for beginners because this is a 12 pan palette. It's an all matte palette. And the Viseart matte formula is one of the best. You've heard me say that a number of times on my channel. One of the best. Pigmented, but blends out really nicely. So some people will say as a beginner, they don't want an eyeshadow with a lot of pigment because, you know, they get nervous or it's difficult to blend. I think a very pigmented eyeshadow is good for a beginner as long as it blends out well. So maybe you go in with a little too much, but if you can blend it out easily and effortlessly, I still think that's a good eyeshadow for a beginner. And Viseart is that. They are pigmented, but they blend so nicely. And then their shimmer metallic formula, which I just became acquainted with this year, is just as nice. It's just as nice. It's beautiful, maybe even more beautiful. This is one of their edit palettes. And the metallic, now they have a number of different formulas, but their standard metallic shimmer formula, not their topper glittery formulas, oh my gosh, so smooth, so silky smooth, but soft. So you're not necessarily going to see it from space. And if you're a beginner, you might not want a metallic that's really like bam, like so noticeable, especially if your blending skills aren't the greatest as yet. You want an eyeshadow formula that's going to be a little more forgiving, and I think this is a beautiful formula. It's a soft more subtle formula, but silky smooth, applies so nicely, blends so beautifully. I think it's a beautiful formula for beginners. And whether you're using their Petite Pro palette, whether you're using an Edit palette, whether you're using their 12 pan Pro palettes or the Grand Pro palettes, the formula is consistent amongst them all the palettes that I have, and I think it's a great formula for beginners to use. Also in the luxury high-end category is Natasha Denona. I just became acquainted with Miss Denona this year, and I have two palettes from her. This is the Glam palette. I also have the mini gold palette, and I know over time she's changed her formulas, but these palettes are more recent releases, and I have to say the formula really nice. I was immediately struck when I used this palette for the first time at just how easy the eyeshadows are to use. The mattes are pigmented, don't necessarily stay true to color in pan. Viseart matte shadows stay true to color. These not so much, but nice pigmentation, but blend very nicely. And you can go in lightly with the mattes, or you can go in a little more heavily. No matter what touch you use, they blend out so well that if you make a mistake, you can blend it out, fix it, and move on. And then the metallic formula, very nice. Again, very similar in softness and subtlety to Viseart. Metallic shimmer shadows that you can wear every day, but you know, you can also wear for night. So very easy to apply, blend really nicely. And I think if you want to spend the extra money, then Natasha makes a nice formula for beginners. And then we have Mother, Pat McGrath. Now, Pat McGrath, I'm only speaking of her 6-pan eyeshadow palettes, okay? I'm not talking about the full-size mothership palettes, because those contain her special shades, and those can be a little more advanced. They're very glittery. You may need glitter glue or an adhesive. So I'm not talking about the special shades. I'm talking about her standard metallic shimmer formula and her matte formula. And she, in my opinion, makes another one of the best formulas in that category. This here is the Rose Decadence. The metallics in here, again, easy to apply, blend out nicely. The mattes, again, pigmented, but blend out really effortlessly. Now, the formula for her mattes and metallics, you'll come across some mattes that feel a little drier in the pan, others that feel more buttery. With the metallics, you'll come across some that feel smoother and more silky in the pan, and others that have more texture. But they're consistent in the performance. The mattes all blend out well, nicely, easily, and the shimmer metallics also beautiful. So if you don't mind spending the money, and you're a beginner and you're one of those that's like, hey, I'm starting out, I want to start off with great quality, then I think the Pat McGrath formula is a good one also. So those are my picks for the best eyeshadow formulas for beginners. Now, for the worst. Now, let me just say that all of the brands I'm going to mention, I love, okay? I love these. But as a beginner, when I was a beginner, even now, I think these formulas are for more of the intermediate to advanced. Okay, for folks who have experience with formulas, with eyeshadows, with placement, with blending, and so you can spend a little more time or do a little more, take a little more effort to work with these formulas. And the first one I'm going to mention, they're actually all indie. The first one I'm going to mention is Give Me Glow. Now, this is their Vintage Rose palette. Give Me Glow, you know how I feel about their eyeshadows. But as a beginner, they are not the easiest to work with. And I'm speaking more so of the matte formula than the shimmer metallic formula. Now, some of their metallics are a little more flaky, a little more textured. So you might want to use a glitter glue to work with it, to use it, but you don't need to. I mean, they're very pigmented. They are so shimmery, so metallic. And they work very nicely. But the mattes, I don't think Give Me Glow makes any matte eyeshadows. I think even they call even their metallic shadows pressed pigments. So pressed pigments have less binder in them and more pure pigment, which can be more difficult to work with. So very pigmented. I mean, and Give Me Glows, oh my goodness, so smooth. Oh, so smooth. But when you apply them to the eye, you might have some problems layering depending on how many you use at once or together. You might have difficulty blending because they're so pigmented, have less binding in them, and you're working more with pure pigment, so they can be a little more difficult to blend. And if you're a beginner, you know, you might get frustrated with that. So Give Me Glow, I think, makes a formula that's beautiful, but you might want to have a little more experience perhaps before you start working with this matte formula. Also, a formula that I would not recommend for beginners, and a lot of people that are more experienced with shadows, there seems to be some mixed reviews on this brand's formula. Some people have a hard time with it, don't like it. Other people like me love it. And that's Ace Beauté. Ace Beauté, again, is another brand that makes very pigmented. I believe a lot of their mattes are pressed pigments, which again means might take a little more elbow grease to get them to blend. You might have issues layering them on top of one on top of another, depending on how many you use, getting them to adhere to your skin. So when you're playing with using formulas such as these, you're gonna need to a little more work and a little more patience. These can also feel dry in the pan, and this is the purple, so purples tend to feel drier. These to me though are pretty smooth. You see that pigment? And then their matte, their metallic eyeshadow formula, very nice, but you know, there are some that are a little more difficult to pick up on the brush, so that might be problematic for beginners. So it's definitely a brand eyeshadow formula that I would recommend for people who have a little more experience. And then lastly is another indie brand whose formula also gets mixed reviews and can differ from palette to palette, and that's Melt Cosmetics. Melt is also very expensive. Actually, both of these brands are kind of on the expensive side, even though they're all indie. Melt is actually an eyeshadow formula that I'm not always thrilled with, to be honest with you. For example, here is the Morte palette. Now, I have several Melt Cosmetics palettes, and I bought the majority of them, I think, this year because the color stories are always amazing. The pigmentation of the mattes is woo, wow. And because they tend to be so pigmented, and I think a lot of theirs tend to be pressed pigments as well, they can be difficult to blend. They can be, again, difficult to layer. Look at that pigmentation. Oh, they can be difficult to layer and they can be difficult to blend. I've had my own issues with blending, with patchiness of some of their matte eyeshadows. So for a beginner, I think their metallic formula is nice. The thing with Melt is that, you know, they're not always consistent. So from palette to palette, collection to collection, some are really great, others not so much. In my opinion, their She's and Parties palette is the best one, but again, very pigmented. The mattes in here, very, very pigmented. So I think if you're a beginner, you might prefer a formula that you can build up the pigmentation, but I've never been one of those people. I've always liked pigment right out the gate. So for me, if it's going to be super pigmented, I want it to blend very easily. And with Melt, that's not always the case. Let me know down below. Do you agree with me? Do you agree with any of these brands that I mentioned? Which ones are your worst and best eyeshadow formulas for beginners? Which ones did you start off with or found that you had the easiest time or the worst time when you were learning? If you found this video helpful, then please give it a like and consider subscribing, because I do makeup hauls, swatches, tutorials, and reviews here every Saturday. I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope to see you again next week. Until then, bye-bye.